Great. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to our webinar on how entrepreneurship policy can speed the road to post-COVID-19 recovery. My name is Kevin Anselmo. I lead the communications for the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. If you're not familiar with Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, we are the world's foremost study on entrepreneurship, providing policymakers with data that informs the decision-making around entrepreneurial activity. This webinar is essentially a preview of our forthcoming report that's coming out on September 15th. It's entitled Diagnosing COVID-19 Impacts on Entrepreneurship. This report is sponsored by Shopify. If you're not familiar with Shopify, Shopify is a leading global commerce company providing trusted tools to entrepreneurs to start, grow, market, and manage a retail business of any size. So today you will have the opportunity to learn from two great guests. Aileen Ionescu-Somers is the Executive Director of the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. Welcome, Aileen.
Hello, great to be here.
And great, as well as Clark Rabbior. He is the Head of Government Relations at Shopify. Welcome, Clark.
Thanks, Kevin. Great to be here.
Great. So, Clark, let's start out with you. Can you first talk a little bit about how COVID-19 has impacted Shopify's business, and particularly the entrepreneurs that you work with?
Yeah, for sure. I think very early on in the pandemic, we had a company meeting. Our CEO brought us all together and said, listen, we're going to be at the front lines of those that are impacted the most by the lockdowns and the pandemic, and said, it's going to be tough working remotely, but we're going to have to do everything we possibly can to support them during this time. Early on, we realized that the changes we were expecting to happen in 2030 got brought to 2021. And what that meant for us was that the products that we were working on and really thinking of 2-3 years down the road of developing, we took that and said, listen, we have to drop the quality to get these products into the market so that these entrepreneurs can use them immediately. Things like curbside pickup, local delivery. The world just changed so fast that it forced us to really quickly get our product teams working on things that were going to have an immediate impact for these entrepreneurs. And we knew that our speed and what we can do was directly going to relate to their success on being resilient through this time. And so not only did we release a kind of a suite of support tools, we also ramped up getting those products to market. We released our platform for free for 3 months because we realized that a lot of these companies were fearful that the financial risk of getting online or getting digital was something that was always a bit of an impediment to them. And so we wanted to drop that immediately and say, listen, this is an unprecedented time. We're here with you. We're going to give you every support that we possibly can. And so with that really accelerating timeline, we all got together and said, listen, we have to go. We have to release everything we possibly can to support them during this time. We also want to make sure that our voice and what we were doing during that time was letting people know that the economic recovery that is going to happen post-pandemic really needs to incorporate more voices, not less. So that really needs to be driven by small businesses and entrepreneurs. And so we're really using our voice during that time to not only support them, but also let policymakers know and especially the press know, listen, these are the businesses you need to support. You need to do it right now. And so before I throw it over to Aileen, an interesting statistic that we saw that was interesting was that in the first phase of the pandemic, we of course we're known for providing our e-commerce solution. We also have a point of sale physical hardware. Those businesses that were using our physical point of sale hardware, during that kind of lockdown phase, we saw their revenue decline by about 71%. However, those exact same businesses recovered 94% of that revenue by getting online in that time. And so what we saw was this incredible resilience from these entrepreneurs pivoting during a time when they had to, and making sure that they're opening omni-channel opportunities for them to reach their customers from wherever they may be. So on the entrepreneurship side, we've really put the pedal to the metal and said, let's do whatever we can to support. And personally at Shopify, it's unique. It's a different world. And we were just talking about this we're probably one of the earlier companies to say, we're remote forever. I'm going to be in this lovely kind of darkish room for enough time, so I'm going to need to invest in some nice lighting. But the beautiful thing about that is our businesses that we support on Shopify are global, and by being remote, it's now going to allow us to hire even a more global workforce, so representative of the entrepreneurs on our platform. So that's something we're really excited about.
Yeah. So another organization that's used to going to be used to working from home more frequently moving forward, and already is Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. Aileen, I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about a little bit of a different perspective, right? A little bit of a different
very
impact
different organization.
in terms of what Shopify. I mean, Shopify is really an outlier here. Can you talk a little bit about the COVID-19 impact on an organization like Global Entrepreneurship Monitor?
Well, of course, I mean, we have 300 plus academics and researchers working at GEM, with GEM at any one time, and they are in universities and business schools throughout the world. And so when you think about it, universities and academics are in a sector that has been the most impacted in terms of the disruption, sheer disruption.
Sure.
And so a lot of our academics and researchers have been very overwhelmed actually throughout the first 6 months of the crisis as they switched to online and blended learning, education, etc. And even as we speak, they have a lot of challenges to actually run the courses and programs and research with success. But I think it's indicative of something that it's a very encouraging sign that all of our teams, all 54 of our teams participated in the work leading to this report. This is indicative of the importance that they lend to this issue. And I think, you know, as people will see the report next week, it reflects very well that there is a lot of change happening out there. And Clark has already referred to that change for his business. The other thing that I would say is that when entrepreneurship research is actually more important than ever now in this post-crisis period. But at the same time, financial resources for research are probably going to be a bit scarcer. But we have very good indicators that in Europe, for example, we'll be putting more resources into GEM research for certain countries that actually we never even worked with before. Mm-hmm. It's clear that there's a new interest in promoting entrepreneurship as part of the post-COVID recovery. But of course, you know, more research on entrepreneurship may be a little bit more tricky for developing economies. And so we're going to have to be a little bit more clever about our resources and finding financial resources for research as we move forward. And lastly, I would say, never waste a crisis. Huh? GEM has had a good hard look at itself to understand how it can be more relevant. And for example, we have included COVID-19 relevant questions in the surveys this year, which are taking place as we speak. And the results of these will be available in the first quarter of 2021. This means that overall our research has become very COVID-19 relevant, and I think it'll have to be that way for the foreseeable future.
So back to you, Clark. You had mentioned in your initial response about communications to policymakers after COVID-19 had become part of our day-to-day living. I can imagine in your role as head of government relations at Shopify, your role in February of 2020 and your role in March 2020 moving forward look completely different, or is my assumption. Maybe you can shed light on that and talk a little bit about how you know, Shopify is thinking about how it works with policymakers and how it communicates different messages, the sorts of messages that you'd like to see communicated to policymakers.
Yeah, it's a good question, Kevin. I think our goal in how we communicate to policymakers hasn't changed. I think what's changed is the incredible importance and pressure we're now putting on them to think about entrepreneurs and small businesses in the kind of new climate now. We've always our role and our goal with especially government relations at Shopify and our engagement with policymakers was really to represent the 1 million businesses that are on Shopify, and we wanted to use this voice and use our access to some of these policymakers to make sure that they're listening and hearing the concerns of these entrepreneurs. And we represent really the shift to the digital economy. So what I mentioned earlier of 2030 coming to 2021, that's really the massive influx of business now being conducted online. And what we want to make sure that policymakers understand is that there's a way for this digital transformation to benefit more voices, more entrepreneurs, more small businesses, rather than resulting in the amalgamation and kind of, I would say, the kind of maybe proliferation of big businesses and places that kind of stifle small businesses and their voice. And we want to make sure that policymakers knew what the issues were that our businesses were facing. So that could be from shipping, from taxes, to just getting online. And the biggest thing that we're looking at right now, which is critical, and what I mentioned earlier of the ability for these entrepreneurs to be resilient and pivot when they're being told that they can't open their store, and who knows what the future holds. And if there's more of these lockdowns, there's a greater need than ever before to make sure connectivity is as high as possible across the world, to make sure that entrepreneurs have equal access wherever they may be, to access online tools, to make sure that they're not only continuing to operate if they're told that they have to close their doors, but also being able to grow during that time and access new markets, new customers. And so that's why we were thrilled to work with GEM. And we've been speaking with you guys for many years now, and you put out fantastic work. And I think the biggest thing we've seen is that policymakers were very quick, just due to the nature of how much government intervention there was over the past 6 months. They were very quick to focus on the large employers, ensuring financial liquidity, incentivizing business model modifications. We need them to really, really focus in on what is going to support entrepreneurship and growth of small businesses during this time. And so this report that you're putting out, we're really excited to see not only what that means for each individual country, but also those common themes across multiple geographies, to make sure that this is something that's being put on the map. And so we really are going to be engaging with policymakers for the foreseeable future to make sure that this future economy and the recovery is really built so that we enable more entrepreneurs, more small businesses, rather than the continued focus on potentially these large employers who can take some of that away.
Fantastic. Aileen, I wonder if you can build on any of the points shared there by Clark, as well as, we have 65 people who are tuning into this webinar, as well as we have an audience on Facebook Live. I'm sure several of you have tuned in at some point to our webinar series since really March. We've had a series of different webinars focused on this topic of how, from our research team, sharing how policy has impacted their respective countries and entrepreneurship. So Aileen, I was wondering if you could provide any reaction to anything Clark shared, as well as any of the key findings that you've taken away from this webinar series that we've done over the course of the last several months.
Well, I just think that what Clark has outlined is really a world that is in significant change. We were anyway in a world that was changing, but what the COVID-19 impact has done is accelerate change. We ran, as you mentioned, Kevin, several webinars involving different countries to talk about how policy affects entrepreneurship. And from the webinar series, it was really obvious that this is a crisis like no other before. I mean, we started looking at different crises of before and how policymakers have been reacting to them, and we just didn't find a comparison. That doesn't mean that we don't find some interesting learning from previous crises that we can apply to this new crisis. But really, policymakers, I think they're going to be in a position where they're going to have to innovate themselves. The previous reactions to previous crises, that just won't be the deal for the post-COVID-19 era. So broadly, so far, I would say that policymakers have been in a kind of damage control mode, a sort of emergency and assuring liquidity, etc. And broadly from the webinars, it was really obvious that most countries the policymakers have been taking fairly similar approaches, obviously at different levels, depending on resources available within economies. But as we move forward, as right now we're in a phase where, for example, the furloughing, the subsidization of salaries, the propping up, if you like, of the economy, that's really starting to be gradually phased out. Now, of course, we don't know whether there isn't going to be a second wave where we go right back again to the mode that we have been experiencing for the last 6 months. But assuming that we do have control and there isn't a massive second wave, you know, the jury is out on that. I think policymakers, what our people are saying, what our researchers are saying is that policymakers have to move into a more holistic, much more strategic, more multidimensional way of looking at entrepreneurship and of putting into place the conditions for entrepreneurship that will be conducive to entrepreneurs having a voice, to taking on their role, to moving from informal to formal sectors of the economy, to moving from necessity-based, so that's kind of desperation-based entrepreneurship, which we expect to see a lot of in the first instance after post the crisis, but to move away from that necessity-based entrepreneurship to opportunity-based entrepreneurship, and to be able then to grasp those opportunities and go forward. So there's a broad agreement from our teams that recovery will be slow, but policymakers have a choice: either accelerate or slow down even further the recovery process. And that means if you want to go fast in the long term, you have to look at things holistically. And GEM actually does have tools to do that. So that's why the report is going to be very interesting from that point of view for policymakers.
Yeah, great. Aileen, just if you could build a little bit on your points and talk a little bit about how you see COVID-19 impacting entrepreneurship as it relates to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, just very briefly on the SDGs. You know, I think we've been in such a crisis mode that SDGs, which had been starting to really get onto the radar screen, certainly of companies and of governments, for a while now, in the last 6 months, it sort of had to be not so much the focus, and the radar screen positioning has got somewhat weaker, I would think. But I mean, when you think of it, one of the things that we look at is necessity-based entrepreneurship versus opportunity-based entrepreneurship. We expect to see a gush, you know, of necessity-based entrepreneurship identifiable in our hard data as of, you know, starting now, really. You know, people who are desperate, who have lost their jobs, who really want to start a business because they basically have no other option. Mm-hmm. And, you know, one thing I will say about the Sustainable Development Goals is that the Sustainable Development Goals also represent opportunities, you know, opportunities for entrepreneurs to actually think about, well, how can I bring a solution to these goals, and how can I actually build a business on that basis? I would say also there's one other thing that, you know, we'll be interested in keeping a finger on the pulse, if you like, of how entrepreneurs are moving from what you call the informal to the formal environment. Informal being that you're not actually registered as an entrepreneur, and therefore you don't access any help from governments, etc., etc. So we keep a close eye on how that dynamic works, informal to formal. And, you know, obviously it's ideal that there would be more entrepreneurs joining the formal economy, moving out of that poverty mode. And of course, this is all in favor of the SDG goals. And by the way, just one last thing, SDG, what we are planning to do actually in 2021, apart from reporting on the impacts of COVID-19, from a hard data standpoint, we're also going to produce a special topic report on SDGs, which it would be quite interesting from the COVID-19 point of view to talk about all these topics in the SDG report next year.
Yeah. Clark, do you have any reaction to anything Aileen just said there from your perspective as it relates to opportunity, necessity-based entrepreneurship, or anything else that she said around SDGs? Any reaction or thoughts to build on that?
Yeah, no, I thought that was great. And yeah, to that point is entrepreneurs are at the end of the day, they're problem solvers. They see an opportunity and they build a business around it. And this creativity and problem solving is a very powerful vehicle for change and for solving some of the world's most complex problems. And so we work with a lot of community partners at Shopify who use these SDGs as guideposts on how to create an impactful business for the future. And so although they're not suitable for every context, for any entrepreneur who wants to make an impact on the world, potentially at a global scale, they're a wonderful opportunity and organizing framework around global priorities that we should be focused on in the long term.
So Clark, you had shared in one of your previous responses about Shopify's enthusiasm to collaborate with GEM on our forthcoming report. I was wondering if you can build a little bit on that. What was the impetus, if you could share with those tuning in, the impetus for Shopify reaching out to GEM and collaborating around this report that will provide policymakers with some real concrete evidence about what's happened and what the future looks like as it relates to the entrepreneurial outlook?
Yeah, and I think Aileen mentioned it earlier today, was that governments are moving at such a breakneck speed that they are looking for data-driven analyses and analyses from experts in the field to really drive what they see as the framework for the recovery. And these governments are going to play a huge role in the kind of future economy and what we're looking at in the near future here, especially for small businesses and entrepreneurs. And so at Shopify, we really do believe every new business adds more value to the world. It's not a zero-sum game, and commerce does benefit from more voices, not fewer. And so we were really thrilled to work with you all. And I just want to take a moment to thank all of the GEM researchers in the field who took the opportunity to contribute to this report, because it's going to, what we're excited by is to see not only how countries reacted during the pandemic, but what is the foundation and the steps that are necessary to take to make sure that recovery is in favor of these entrepreneurs. And so you have the incredible network, the best researchers in the field, and we were excited to enable them to provide this nonpartisan advice on how policymakers can support these entrepreneurs who are at the front line of our economy. And so seeing those trends across the countries and jurisdictions, what's unique is not only great for us to enable us to go and talk to these policymakers and point to the report and talk about how this is what is being seen in the field, but also give everyone across the world a resource to look to as they look to form and kind of create the new conditions for policymakers to build as we come out of what we're hoping, who knows what the future lies, but the end of this pandemic.
Great. Aileen?
Well, when we were, well, let's start by saying that we have lived in the last 6-7 months, 8. We've lived through an extraordinary time in our lives. And when we were gathering information for this report, we realized that it could be actually fairly iconic in GEM's history. We've produced a lot of reports over our 21 years. But the report that will be coming out next week is a photo album, if you like, with snapshots, because we're in a highly volatile, as Clark was saying, very much a dynamic situation. So we'll have a big collection, global collection of snapshots of developments during the first months of this crisis. We went to our 54 national teams to get their perspectives, almost from the trenches, if you think of it as, they're in the war, in the trenches, trying to understand the immediate impacts on entrepreneurship. And we invited some of GEM's most experienced researchers to go even further, you know, so snapshots on the one hand, we have 54 country snapshots. And then we asked some of our most experienced researchers to go even further to understanding, you know, how policymakers have been reacting to this crisis. So although the, I suppose, more hard data report will come out early next year, that's the global report of GEM, which is very well known. What this report gives, it's a kind of like an early harbinger, an early announcement of things to come. The fact that we have these 300 plus researchers, very eminent researchers in entrepreneurship out there in the trenches, means that we can pull up a very good feel for the state of the art of you know, impact of COVID-19 on entrepreneurship worldwide, both on entrepreneurs and also on entrepreneurial contexts. So what I think the report will give is an opportunity to policymakers for benchmarking and learning from others. I kind of think of it as crowdsourcing as a sense, and I did mention earlier that policymakers also need to innovate. And so crowdsourcing is always a very good thing to leapfrog and to move towards innovative solutions. So it'll give the opportunity to policymakers to innovate on a more robust basis. And GEM, with all its history, you know, 21 years, it has robust tools that are described in the report, and it cannot be denied. It'll be invaluable to policymakers as they move, as I said earlier, you know, beyond the damage control towards a more long-term strategic approach.
Great. So that essentially is the content that we had for everyone that has been attending. You know, essentially we wanted to give you a little preview, a little taster of what you can expect when this report goes live next week. It will go live a week from today on the 15th of September. Be sure to check out the Global Entrepreneurship website to access the report. You can also subscribe to our newsletter. We'll be sure that we have a newsletter that will go out that day announcing the report, 54 different economy profiles, the in-depth reports that Aileen mentioned, a Q&A interview with Clark will be in the report as well. So feel free to subscribe via the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor website. And one other call to action, if you are interested in being part of our launch webinar for the report, that will be taking place on Thursday, the 17th, the same exact time as this webinar. You can subscribe and register for that webinar as well by going to our website. We will also include a link in our post-webinar communications. On that webinar, we will have a policymaker's perspective, a GEM researcher perspective, as well as an entrepreneur's perspective. And we'll also be sure to allow time for Q&A. This webinar is a bit more concise. We want to keep within that 30-minute time frame, but we will, for that next webinar, we will open it up for questions and respond to those questions. So Aileen and Clark, thank you very much for sharing all these terrific insights. Thank you to all of you who have joined us, and we wish you a good rest of your day.
Thanks so much, Kevin.
Thanks, Kevin.
Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.